7. On force and evil. Apparently, in the utilization of physical compulsion and suppression as methods of influence, there are 3 points that may seem to stand against spirituality and love. First, an appeal to the human will as such, in addition to clarity and love. Second, the impact on the subject's will independent of their consent, perhaps even in spite of it. And third, the actual impact generated by the body. Indeed, in the essence of what we are discussing, all 3 factors are inherent and, of course, not separate, but engaged in a mutual fusion. Physical compulsion and suppression do not appeal to clarity and love, but act on the body of the compelled against its consent. It is this connection of all 3 features that often produces in sentimental souls such an impression which causes them indignation and incites protest and rejection of outrageous violence. However, physical compulsion and suppression, indeed including all these 3 points, do not at all become matters of evil or evil means of interaction. They can and should not work against spirituality and not work against love. This is their essential difference from violence, and it is in this measure, and only in this measure, that they are worthy of spiritual and moral acceptance. In truth, man's spirituality consists in the fact that he himself autonomously seeks, desires, and has in mind objective perfection, educating himself towards this vision and creativity. It is in this nature and in this breath that the inner freedom of man is sacrosanct and the external manifestations of it are inviolable. It is the orientation of the spiritual eye towards perfection that will sanctify the power of inner self-government and give the external actions of a person their spiritual significance. It is the strength of internal self-government that shapes the personality of the spiritually sighted person, and then his external behavior does not need to be curbed and does not tolerate compulsion. Moreover, so long as the strength of spiritually willful self-government is intact in man, any error in visible content does not need to be subjected to suppression or compulsion, but instead to his own remedy, perhaps in conjunction with the help of others. And while the goal in man is a strong-willed focus on perfection, the weakness of an independent stance needs not suppression and compulsion, but the loving efforts of self-education. However, if a person affirms his independence with evil deeds, abusing his autonomy and degradingly perverting his spirituality, his personality turns into a deep inner division. On the one hand, his spirituality is potentially not yet extinguished. Somewhere, in its unfulfilled depths, it retains the ability to turn the eye to spiritual perfection and embark on the path of self-restraint and self-government. And only special evidence testifying to a liquid absolute villainy can make us completely discount this possibility. But, on the other hand, it turns out that the forces of his soul are actually absorbed in anti-spiritual content and aspirations which turn against love, his spiritual eye is closed or blinded, his passions and deeds breathe enmity and division. He does not exercise spirituality, but anti-spirituality, and the inherent power of his love becomes perverted and pernicious. Clarity does not rule him through will, love does not satisfy him. He lives and acts not as a spiritually free lord of his soul and his behavior, but as a helpless slave of his evil impulses and mental mechanisms. He becomes not that which he could potentially be, and cannot become what he is in the hidden meaning of his emptiness. His personality consists of a deceased spirit and an intensely charged anti-spirituality born from a dying love, a cold indifferent cynicism, and searing anger. And it is precisely the dual composition of his personality that confronts other, spiritually healthy people with the task of compulsion and suppression. It is already clear that resisting the activities of such a person is not fighting with spirituality, but with anti-spirituality, and counteracting not love, but shameless malice. The resistor's energy is directed not against the empty, numb, hidden potential of the villain, but against the ongoing imprisonment of his soul in the external actions of the elements that saturate him. From the outset, there is no doubt that resorting to the remedy of inducement does not in any way exclude a parallel appeal to his clarity and love, but on the contrary, it often makes it possible for the first time, because the angry malcontent, if he does not curb his obsession, will find that the persuasive voice and the rays of someone else's love only blind him and irritate his frenzy, and he cannot and will not curb his will and shall not want without someone else's helping compulsion and suppression. The more whole and complete the villainous soul, the weaker it is in those soul organs that are capable of understanding the spiritual vision and being touched by a singing love. For the passions that absorb, in their charged and incessant destruction, precisely those very powers and abilities of the soul, those which transform and ennoble the action out of which flourishes love and clarity. A villain could have loved, had he not put all the power of love into a stream of cynical, hateful torment which delighted him. A villain could find God in the mountains, the positive power of conscience, far beauties, and the rights of men, if all his power did not go towards wicked guile and prudently squirming intrigue. And the one who puts a stop to this eruption of malice, who suppresses this outflow, shines forth, puts the soul in the position of an external frustration, a fruitless accumulation of internal energy and the inevitable draining of it in the form of a restless and gnawing distress. This inward turn is the first and necessary condition for the purification and transformation of the soul, if it is at all still capable of it. This is why the suppression of a villain's external crimes is not the enemy of love and clarity, and indeed not their creative impetus, but only their necessary and faithful servant. However, turning now to address the will of the villain, he has before him a healthy internal force, capable of self-compulsion and self-restraint, but a shattered, decayed, restless carnality. If this is his will, then his will is blind, not leading, but possessed, not discerning, but loaded, and even if it does reign, it does so from beneath the authority of evil passions. It is a will that does not know self-restraint and does not wish to know it, and is already so internally motivated that the force of mental compulsion coming from outside turns out to be powerless and untenable. However, this is all the same will, determinative, realizing itself in the flow of external actions and behaviors, achieving its vital satisfaction. To insist that external pressure on this will is permissible only with its preliminary consent can only be the insistence of a spiritually and psychologically naive person. For only spiritual naivete is able to revere the autonomy of malevolent carnality, and only psychological naivete can admit the malevolent carnality its pleasures in the form of consent, that which external interference would deprive of it. Therefore, one should not be shuffled off or hindered by the dissent of this wicked desire. The villain, of course, expresses dissent with his fury, and this is natural, for evil would not be evil but good-natured weakness if it were reconciled with opposition. But the resisting, compelling, and suppressing, outwardly hostile action against the actively wicked desires of the villain is intended to make contact with his potential spirituality in the belief that this spirit is still free because it is still alive, that it is at his side. The autonomy of the villain would be sacred then only if it remained a manifestation of the spirit in spite of malice and atrocities. But in reality it is a manifestation of anti-spirituality, and its essence is no longer in the law of the person, autonomy, and not in self-government, but in lawlessness and self-destruction. Finally, all of this compulsive and suppressive resistance is by no means a manifestation of evil, or an evil deed merely because it is transmitted to man through the medium of his body. In fact, a man's body is not above his soul and is not more sacred than his spirit. It is nothing but the outer manifestation of its inner substance or, what is the same, the embodied existence of its identity. The human body conceals within itself both its spirit and its passions, but hides them so that the body instead reveals them physically, as if expressing them in another, sensually external language, so that the visionary eye can, as it were, read a man's soul's speech by way of an organic allegory, literally by a parable, of its external composition and its external manifestations. Perhaps the language of the body, this material fabric of immaterial virtue and evil, is more fundamental, more coarse than the psychospiritual language, but in the terrestrial life people, disguised separately in individuals' bodies, are not allowed to communicate with each other except through their bodies. Through voice, gesture, and touch they convey to each other information about their internal states and relationships, signaling arbitrarily and involuntarily. And if it is inevitable and permissible for a human being to express bodily sympathy, approval, and acceptance, it is equally unavoidable and permissible that people bodily convey to each other a lack of sympathy, disapproval, and rejection, that is, spiritual condemnation, righteous indignation, and determined opposition. And here the physical pressuring of the other person against his consent, taken as a sign of resolute, willful resistance to his spiritually forbidden external behavior, can turn out to be the only spiritually precise and spiritually sincere word of communication between people. and moreover, this influence, mentally straining and shaking both sides and formulating their spiritual divergence and struggle in the language of physical strength, does not at all become hostile either to the correctly understood spirituality of man or to the true understanding of love. A spiritually healthy person cannot but be indignant at the sight of an internally triumphant and externally striving evil. He cannot help feeling that tolerance of it is not only an allowance, an approval, a silent encouragement, but also complicity in these deeds, and considering the villain in conscience to be a violent hotbed of anti-spirituality and seeing the futility of spiritual and verbal compulsion, he cannot, dares not, should not refrain from external suppression. For if the body of man is not above a man's soul, and is not more sacred than his spirit, it is not at all an inviolable sanctuary for malice or an unapproachable refuge for vicious passions. The body of a villain is instrumental of evil, its organ, and being inseparable from it and present within it, evil fills the body and through it pours itself into the world. A villain's body is the abode of his malice, and this spiritually devastated territory is by no means extraterritorial for someone else's spirit. Awe in the face of the villain's body rather than trembling before the face of God is unnatural. It is moral prejudice, spiritual cowardice, weakness, and sentimental superstition. This trembling restriction of a healthy and sure spiritual impulse by some kind of psychosis leads a person under the banner of non-resistance to evil by violence to total non-resistance to evil, that is, to spiritual desertion, betrayal, collaboration, and self-defilement. The physical influencing of another person against his will is spiritually shown in life each time that internal self-government betrays a person and there remain no psycho-spiritual resources to prevent the irreparable consequences of errors or evil passions. He is right who pushes the first-time explorer away from a cliff's edge, who will rip poison from the clutches of a hardened suicidal, who will strike the hands of the aiming revolutionary in time, who will knock down the arsonist at the last minute, who will expel blasphemous and disgraceful people from the temple, who will rush with arms at a crowd of soldiers raping a girl, who will bind the deranged and tame the possessed villain. These actions are a demonstration of ill will. Shall it not be found in the midst of condemnation, indignation, and anger a genuine will to prevent the realization of evil? Are we to see in such acts a violation of the spiritual principle in man? No, but instead, willful assertion of it in itself and the willful appeal to it in another, exposing the bankruptcy of evil. Are these acts which destroy loving unity? No, but instead, acts which faithfully and courageously manifest a spiritual separation between the villain and the non-villain. Are they a betrayal of God's work on earth? No, but faithful and dedicated service to Him. And yet, what if all of this is nevertheless violence? Not every use of force to dissent is violence. The attacker says to his victim, "You are a means for my interest and my lust. You are not an autonomous spirit, but a subordinate object of mine. You are at the mercy of my arbitrariness." By contrast, he who sustains compulsion or suppression on behalf of the spirit does not render the compelled a tool of his interest and his lust, does not deny their autonomous spirituality, does not invite them to become a submissive animated thing, does not render them a victim of his own arbitrariness. But he seems to say to the compelled, "Behold, you control yourself inattentively, erroneously, insufficiently, badly, and stand on the eve of a fatal precipice from which there is no turning back. Or, you humiliate yourself, you rave madly, you trample on your spirituality, you are possessed by the breath of evil, ruin, and death. Stop, for here is the limit." And by this he does not destroy the spirituality of the madman, but presupposes the beginning of his self-restraint and self-construction. He does not demean his dignity, but compels him to stop his self-abasement. He does not violate his autonomy, but requires its restoration. He does not attack his convictions, but shakes his blindness and makes him conscious of his own lack of principle. He does not strengthen his antipathy, but puts an end to the domain of his hatred. The attacker attacks, the suppressor deflects. The attacker demands obedience to himself, whereas he who compels requires obedience to the spirit and its laws. The attacker despises the spiritual principle in man, while he who compels honors it and defends it. The attacker self-servingly hates, the suppressor moves not with anger or greed, but with fair and righteous indignation. Of course, there are also similarities. Both the attacker and the suppressor do not persuade or caress, both act on the person with no regard to his consent, and neither hesitates before influencing their target's external behavior. But what kind of evidence is required in addition to that, on the basis of these formal analogies, to affirm the essential identity and spiritual equivalence of violence and suppression? We can see that the entire doctrine which equates anti-spirituality with resistance through the means of physical compulsion and suppression directed against villains falls as an untenable prejudice and superstition. It is not compulsion or suppression which are anti-spiritual and contrary to love, but vicious abuse. And in this, a person is always wrong. In some sense, is mad, in some sense, is the realization of rage, and in some sense, is guilty of having despised another's spirituality, transforming them into a means for his desire, and his injustice remains irrespective of whether or not his deeds bring moral good or moral harm to himself or his victim. Compulsion directed against the villain, and malicious violence, to whomsoever it is directed, are not the same, and their confusion is baseless, unjust, biased, and blind. But if, then, the physical conflict and the compulsion of man by man is not evil, then evil is not reducible to effects on man through the medium of his body or to the infliction of physical suffering on one's neighbor. In fact, evil can manifest itself and usually does manifest itself not only in the form of physical violence and the associated physical anguish it brings. It would be naive to think that the activities of a villain are reduced to physical assault, property seizure, injury, rape, and murder. Of course, all these acts usually find little or no resistance in the criminal's soul, and, externally infecting the good of others, villains inflict through such means vital, mental, and spiritual damage. Moreover, violent villains, having conspired and organized, can inflict untold damage upon the spiritual life not only of individuals, but of whole nations, and of all mankind. And yet, physical violence is not the only, nor the most important, nor the most destructive manifestation of their villainy. A person expires not only when he is poor, starving, suffering, and dying, but when he is weakened in spirit and decays morally and religiously. Not only when it is difficult for him to survive or it becomes impossible to maintain his existence, but when he lives in a demeaning manner and dies of disgrace. Not when he suffers or endures deprivation and misfortune, but when he surrenders to evil. And to bring a person to this self-understanding, to tolerance, to submission, to taking delight in evil and devoting oneself to it, physical violence is often not the easiest method, but instead other, softer means are preferable. Moreover, physical violence often leads to the opposite result, to purifying the soul, strengthening and tempering the spiritual will. Evil finds entry to the soul much easier when it creeps and pilfers than when it attacks or destroys. It is more appropriate for evil to wear a mask than to reveal its hideousness at the outset. Therefore, villains, wishing to overcome the non-villains, not only attack and kill, but praise evil, reproach good, lie, slander, flatter, propagandize, and agitate. Then, gaining authority, they issue orders and prohibitions, they exile and compel by threat, they tempt sensually by intoxicating the eyes, the ears, and the consciousness, catering to bad instincts and kindling them to a state of boiling passion. They awaken feelings of resentment, jealousy, enmity, vindictiveness, hatred, and anger in the souls of the people, put them into painful, humiliating, unbearable conditions of life, bribe with profit, honor, and power, try to undermine the soul's self-esteem, as well as respect and trust given by people to their friends, whom they accustom to evil by simple repetition, shameless example, invisible infection, suggestion, shattering of will, inculcation of infernal mental mechanisms, and then at last they try to cover all of this with sheer fortune, impunity, uproar, drunkenness, and feasting. Acrimonious violence and murder percolate, of course, in the disgusting atmosphere of this villainous procession, but the main manifestation of evil and the most pernicious consequence of it remains precisely the qualitative perversion and the architectural decomposition of the living spirit. The violence itself, for all of its outward crassness, carries its poison not so much for the body as for the spirit, and murder itself, for all its tragic irreparability, is not meant so much for the victims as for the survivors. Both incite terror and intensify the effect of temptation. They shake the will, awaken the passions, and distort clarity. This is why one must recognize that external violence manifests evil and establishes its scope, but evil is not at all determined and is not exhaustively defined by external violence. This is the correctly understood relationship between physical compulsion, violence, and evil.